At long last, Gran Turismo has truly returned, leaving behind the interesting but ultimately incomplete GT Sport. Gran Turismo 7 marks perhaps the most complete and full-fledged GT experience since the PlayStation 2 days, with an exhaustive single-player component harkening back to the old days. Combined with a gorgeous, fresh coat of paint, GT7 feels both true to its roots, but also fresh at the same time. It also represents Polyphony Digital's first PlayStation 5 game, arriving a little over a year after the launch of the new system, leading us to wonder how this new entry fares on Sony's latest console, and how it compares against the prior release in GT Sport. So on today's video, we'll explore the visuals and presentation of Gran Turismo 7 on PlayStation 5, looking closely at its cars, tracks, and technical features, in addition to finally getting to the bottom of the ray tracing questions while also testing performance. As has become tradition with big releases then, we'll have a second video in the wake of this production detailing the comparisons between PS5 and the last generation PS4 and PS4 Pro, so keep an eye out for that. But for now, let's dive into the world of Gran Turismo 7 right here on Digital Foundry. 25 years ago, the original Gran Turismo arrived, changing the landscape of console racing games forever, with its focus on real-world cars and a semi-realistic simulation of driving. It was a huge success, reaching its peak during the PlayStation 2 era with a perfect mix of stunning visuals and finely tuned gameplay. But with the shift to HD, there was a sense that Polyphony Digital struggled to bring the series to a new era, and while the games that would follow were certainly well made, there's a certain purity and joy that had been lost along the way. With Gran Turismo Sport on PlayStation 4, however, the team rebuilt its technology, focusing on refining the actual driving experience, as well as the multiplayer and the visuals. But this came at a cost. The traditional Gran Turismo experience was greatly pared back. Now, with Gran Turismo 7, you finally get a sense that everything has coalesced into what feels like the perfect mix. It combines Sport's exceptional driving model and visuals with the content and progression the series was once known for. In that sense, GT7 does seem to have been built directly on the GT Sport engine, which perhaps explains why it's a cross-generation release in the first place, but that doesn't mean we don't have a beautiful game here on PS5. So what does this mean in practice then? Well, in building Gran Turismo 7 for the PlayStation 5, I see several key areas where Polyphony took advantage of the new hardware to improve the overall experience. Primarily, image quality, the addition of ray-traced reflections, and the elimination of loading times. There's more, of course, which we'll discuss shortly, but let's begin with these three elements. Image quality is simple. With GT Sport, Polyphony targeted 1800p resolution reconstructed using checkerboard rendering, along with an effective TAA solution. For GT7 on PlayStation 5, however, they've moved up to a full native 4K resolution, something we had only previously seen in Forza Motorsport 7, but with TAA rather than MSAA providing a cleaner overall image. But there's more to this than just the resolution. Other aspects of the image have been greatly improved. Things like texture filtering, shadow quality, reflection quality, and more have all been enhanced. It's not perfect, mind you, but it goes a long way to reducing some of the visual artifacts that you could previously spot in GT Sport. One of my favorite additions is the inclusion of a per-pixel motion blur during actual gameplay, rather than just replays. I believe GT Sport offered something like this, at least when using the low-resolution modes on PS4 Pro, but it's nice to finally see this effect used at full resolution on PS5. It greatly improves the sense of speed and feeling of motion. So that's the first key improvement then. Image quality is a significant step up from GT Sport, but honestly, a simple resolution bump is nothing to get too excited about. There's a lot more here. And in fact, one of my complaints is that there aren't any lower resolution options that might have allowed for a certain other feature during actual gameplay. I'm talking, of course, about ray-traced reflections, which is our second point of discussion today. I can finally answer the question then with certainty. ray tracing is not available during gameplay. This had been previously confirmed, but there was still some confusion around it. With that question answered then, what is it actually used for, and how does it look? Well, firstly, in the options, you're offered the choice between ray tracing and a higher frame rate mode. Essentially, when using ray traced reflections, this feature is engaged in basically every scene featuring the cars, except actual gameplay. This means replays, the various interludes, and everything else within the menu system will use ray tracing, but the frame rate is capped at 30 FPS when doing so. If you disable ray tracing though, replays and other interstitial sequences will update at a higher frame rate instead, which is something we'll test later in the video. So let's talk about this feature then. The reason why ray tracing is so desirable in this case comes down to the nature of cars and the materials they're made from. One of the key strengths in Gran Turismo lies in its treatment of car paint. There's a real attention to detail paid to the way the light works across a wide range of surfaces. This was already exceptionally well done in GT Sport, and GT7 is simply a continuation of this work, a refinement if you will. So most cars, when painted, use something called a clear coat to seal the paintwork and protect the body for increased durability. And this clear coat actually has an impact on the way light is reflected back towards our eye. In GT7, the game actually simulates the base paint first, followed by additional layering such as a metallic coating, and then finally the clear coat itself. It's this simulation of these multiple layers that allows for such realistic surfaces across the game's vehicles. And with ray traced reflections, the result is a lot more accurate as the paint reflects not just the environment around you, but also other cars as well as self-reflections. When active, ray tracing is applied to all cars in the field as well, so there's no sharing of reflection textures here. Everything is bespoke and the cars all reflect one another properly. Let's look closer at the reflection itself then. The approach here is similar to Insomniac's work where rays are traced into a simplified model of the environment contained within the acceleration structure to speed up the process. That is, the environment visible within the paint is using a lower detail than the actual environment you see while racing. That's why things like trees and buildings lack detail when you look into the reflection. Instead, most of the rendering budget is spent on the cars themselves, which are presented with a higher level of detail within the acceleration structure, leading to a clean, accurate look within reflections. This pays off big time in replays, which is precisely where you're most likely to notice reflections in the first place. But unfortunately, as noted, it isn't possible to use this feature during actual gameplay. This is where I feel a performance RT mode would be useful. Consoles simply don't have the power to render a game at 4K 60 while also doing ray traced reflections. But I think with a drop in resolution it might actually be possible to achieve. That said, the actual cube and sphere based reflections are markedly improved over GT Sport and they still look pretty good here. Essentially, this older style of reflection uses a range of reflection probes placed around the cars, which capture the environment with each frame. It's less physically accurate, of course, and doesn't capture elements like other cars or in-surface reflections, but while you're actually racing, it is pretty effective. In most views, the reflections even update at a full 60 frames per second, but as we spotted in our preview coverage, when using the cockpit view, reflections are reduced to run at half rate. I believe this is down to the additional reflection probes likely used to simulate reflective surfaces within the cockpit itself. You'll note, for instance, the driver's reflection in this BMW Z8. That's not ray tracing you're seeing. We'll discuss more aspects of the cars and the lighting later in this video, but the point here is that the handling of reflective materials on car surfaces in GT7 is perhaps the best we've ever seen. But that doesn't mean there aren't some caveats here. Ray traced reflections are not currently applied to transparent materials such as glass. So that means the windshield on your car still relies on a cube map instead of the ray traced reflection. It's not that noticeable in most situations, but if you look closely, you'll definitely see that it breaks the continuous nature of the reflections at certain angles. On the more positive side, however, these same cube maps are also used as fallback reflections. This means that reflections within reflections actually still look pretty decent in this game. Whereas titles such as Spider-Man Miles Morales did not use fallback reflections at all. Plus, there's a lot to be said for the way that the reflections are bent based on the surface of each vehicle. They behave in a very realistic fashion. I also want to talk about the roughness cutoff. Essentially, rendering reflections on more diffuse, rougher materials requires more processing, as the photons disperse across the surface. So to save on performance, some games set the roughness cutoff at such a value that rougher materials do not benefit from ray traced reflections. But in the case of Gran Turismo 7, even some of the rougher looking car paints still benefit from these reflections. So although you do not get proper RT on glass surfaces, everything else benefits. While we're looking at the DeLorean, also take a look at the mirror here. Note how the reflection appears sharper where it attaches to the car, and then disperses, becoming a softer, more diffuse reflection as it moves further away. An impressive detail to capture on the reflections. One quick note before we continue, in many of the shots during this video, you'll see black bars on the top and bottom. I've opted for a wider aspect ratio in order to hide the HUD that is prevalent on many of these scenes, like this. It's just a stylistic choice for this video and nothing more. Then we come to the third major point of improvement, and that's loading. The reduction in loading times has been seen as a big deal this generation, but honestly, few games benefit as much as something like Gran Turismo. If you go back to the PlayStation 1 or 2 days, loading was pretty acceptable in these games, but once they moved to HD, the amount of waiting for anything increased dramatically. Even basic menu navigation on PlayStation 3 could be sluggish to the point where it kind of discouraged you from actually experimenting with the game. So with GT7 on PS5, finally, the game is no longer constrained by these issues. It has a huge impact on actual gameplay as a result. Essentially, during the game, you'll be moving around this map view to many different icons and different scenarios, as well as jumping in and out of events and races at a regular clip. This isn't like a linear game where it's streamed in and then you have to deal with loading upon death. You're constantly running into the need to load more data. And in GT7, that loading is now basically instant. Even hopping from the menu into a race has a short pause like this, and then you get started. So these three elements then are the key improvements made to the experience since GT Sport. But there is still more to discuss. So for this next part, I'd like to break the discussion down into two individual pieces, one focusing on the cars and the other on the environments. As always for the series, the rendering and simulation of cars is a huge part of Gran Turismo. By and large, the level of detail here is derived from the already excellent work done on GT Sport, but there are a wide range of new cars that have been added to GT7. The 1989 BMW M3 is an old favorite of mine, for instance, and I feel it really demonstrates Polyphony's strength when it comes to detail and materials work. All the various pieces fit together in a startlingly realistic fashion. You can even zoom all the way in on the headlamps and the detail manages to hold up. It's truly a stunning recreation. It's this perfect simulation of multiple material types combined with the lighting model that really allows the cars to shine. The rounding off of body panels and the way all the different components, made of different materials of course, appear distinct from one another. Most of these things aren't actually visible during racing, but it shows a real love for the source material. The paint simulation is just so good here, really. The metal flakes and different paint styles all behave very realistically under the lighting conditions. The material used on rims as well, and even things like valve stems hold up. There's just so much detail packed into every single vehicle. And the same is true of the interior work, where the discrete difference between fabrics, plastic, and leather can be observed. If we freeze frame here on this Corvette ZR1 for instance, look at the steering wheel. The plasticky carbon fiber bits, the aluminum center decoration, and the leather itself. Each of these elements are distinct and realistic. It's something true of GT7's cars in general, really. You can observe the variation in Fresnel on different surfaces, and as a reminder, Fresnel refers to the way in which light reflects differently based on the angle from which you're viewing it. You can sort of see the fall-off effect as the light spills around the edges, and this varies based on the material type. If we look again at the seats in this C7 Vet then, check out the perforated leather on the seat, the fine stitching, and even the carpet material behind the driver's seat. Of course, it's important to note that all of these high detail interiors are actually used when you drive in the cockpit view, and are even visible in replays. Well, at least on the target car anyway. Of course, there's a lot more to these cars beyond the actual rendering. The simulation of suspension and the dynamics of driving, all of this stuff is supremely important, but slightly beyond the scope of this sort of video. It is clear, however, that Polyphony has poured an absurd amount of time and engineering work into recreating the full lineup of cars available in GT7. Yes, a lot of these details were already present in GT Sport, but all of the newly modeled cars are just so superb looking, and the improvements made for the GT7 engine definitely help everything shine. Speaking of shine, the headlights finally cast proper shadows in GT7. So when driving in darker conditions, the headlights from your car actually project shadows on the cars around you, and it looks very nice in motion, I think. This can also be observed in replays, of course. So cars are clearly the focus of the game then. With that said then, let's examine the tracks themselves, and to do that I'd like to start with a look at the evolution of a certain track. This is Trial Mountain on the original PlayStation. It's one of the series' most iconic tracks, and it has returned for GT7 after having gone missing in GT Sport. It's known for its sweeping curves packed with pine trees, as well as the various tunnel sections, and its, dare I say, moody atmosphere. In the move to PlayStation 2 and Gran Turismo 3, the quality of the environment was greatly enhanced, with more trees, increased geometric detail, and a higher resolution. This is also the first game in the series which introduced proper reflections on cars, where the environment could be seen across the car's paint. On PlayStation 3 then, Trial Mountain featured the expected upgrades with the shift to HD resolutions, but it still felt mostly familiar. In GT7, however, we finally have the best looking iteration of the track, and thanks to the new lighting and materials, it starts to feel more like a real track now. This version of the track is interesting in that it shows what's possible in the GT7 engine. Keep in mind that many of the circuits in this game were first featured and built for GT Sport, and while each of them have received noticeable improvements in GT7, tracks like Trial Mountain, Deep Forest Raceway, and High Speed Ring all had to be completely remade in this new engine. So during actual gameplay and replays then, the track detail does hold up pretty well, and in fact, looking closely, many of these tracks really are beautiful to behold. I'm a huge fan of the Tokyo Expressway, for instance, which exhibits very realistic materials and lighting. The metal, glass, and concrete structures of Tokyo are a perfect showcase for the lighting in GT7. If you look a little too closely though, it's clear that the level of detail maybe isn't quite where I'd like to see it. The GT Sport roots are extremely evident here. This is an interesting point of discussion then. When people talk about the visuals in Gran Turismo 7, the environments are generally a point of critique. And it's true, if you zoom in and look closely at certain elements, as you might do with the game's cars, the detail level does fall short. However, from a more typical point of view, racing, replays, and the like, I think they've done a good job at capturing the look of racetracks. Firstly, let's consider the nature of these courses. Even in real life, racetracks like this are built for racing, and this comes with a very specific sort of design and look. It's not beautiful in the same way that an open world landscape might be. Looking here at Tsukuba, there's actually a good amount of detail present in these flyby shots. The tarmac, grass, and various other surfaces all exhibit a relatively natural appearance that holds up under scrutiny. I think it's bumping up against an uncanny valley-like issue where it's close to photorealism at certain angles, but its limitations stand out significantly more as a result. In some ways, it's the kind of realism you might see in games like Flight Simulator, which relies on real-world data. From flying distance, it can appear very realistic, but if you look too closely, the imperfections become clear, and that's the same thing here. Still, even with this in mind, one of the key reasons why the game looks as good as it does is tied specifically to lighting and weather. Firstly, no matter the time of day, Polyphony has done a great job with simulating the properties of surfaces such as tarmac and how they behave with the lighting. Just driving around in replays, note how the headlights play off the surfaces. It's very realistic and eye-catching, I think. As far as I can tell, they're also still utilizing pre-calculated global illumination data, and they're likely interpolating between the different bakes based on the time of day. And that's key because unlike GT Sport, the time of day does change in real time. You'll have races that begin before sunrise, for instance, and end in the early morning. Sun shadows adjust in real time now as well. All of this helps create a greater sense of variety and realism, as the time of day is no longer static. This is combined with a new dynamic weather and cloud system. Cloud formations vary based on these conditions and change over time, while rain is, of course, also possible. As it rains, the ground becomes increasingly saturated, which not only creates puddles in real time, with reflections no less, but also requires more careful driving. Rain racing is especially beautiful due to the way light reflects off the tarmac surface when wet. One extra detail worth noting here ties to the DualSense controller. The vibration used to simulate driving through puddles is surprisingly effective. This of course also applies to other imperfections and joints in the tarmac. Of course, when you're driving in the rain, GT7 also throws a lot of mist particles around the screen, and these actually appear to be full resolution, which is a far cry from the PS3 days with its super low-res particle system and mountains of slowdown. Also, in cockpit view, rain droplets splash across the windshield, and wipers are in use, complete with motion blur, wiping them away. Again, a huge improvement from older GT titles. I'm also a fan of the droplets applied to the cars, another detail that complements the excellent paintwork. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the sky system once again. As noted, the clouds are dynamic and vary based on the weather, but the simulation of light and different times of day is among the most realistic I've ever seen in a game. It's genuinely jaw-dropping, especially when combined with HDR, which is phenomenal in this game, up there with the best implementations in the market. Still, as good as the game's environments look, I do still see some room for improvement. What Epic is doing with Nanite, for instance, hints at what could be possible in a game like this in the future, at least for environmental detail. So as nice as it looks, I don't actually believe this represents the peak of what's possible this generation. It's still clearly derived from GT Sport. Honestly though, given more time, there's a lot more I could say about the visuals in GT7. But I will say that Polyphony has done a fantastic job here all around. In fact, the team deserves extra kudos for releasing such a polished, complete game. I encountered no bugs or issues throughout the entire review process, which is a rare thing these days. With that said though, it's time we discuss performance. There are effectively 3 individual areas of performance to discuss: the frame rate during gameplay, the frame rate during replays with ray tracing enabled, and replays with ray tracing disabled. So let's begin with the gameplay, and the news here is predominantly very positive. Essentially, in the vast majority of cases, you'll enjoy a completely stable 60 frames per second. Nearly every race runs consistently, even with a full grid of 20 cars on the track. This is the smoothest frame rate that we've seen in Gran Turismo since GT4 on the PlayStation 2. That said, there are 2 specific conditions I uncovered which can cause the frame rate to dip, so let me lay them out. Firstly, Trial Mountain. For whatever reason, this track exhibits dips in performance while simply driving around the track. You can see what I mean here, momentary frame drops that impact the overall fluidity. It seems to be down to the environment itself, thus I believe solving it would require some tweaking of this track. So that's issue number 1 then. Secondly, if you really want to drop the frame rate, if you're nostalgic for those PlayStation 3 days, there is one way to achieve this. Load up a track in the rain at dusk or dawn, fill out the grid with all 20 cars, and for the most pain, make sure you set your starting position at the back of the pack and you don't use rolling start. With this, the screen is filled with reflections, particles, and cars, which causes the frame rate to buckle, as you can see here. This is, I've found, the absolute worst case scenario for GT7. It's something that could be cleaned up with VRR or dynamic resolution scaling, but alas, this is what we have in these situations. Thankfully, rain alone doesn't typically cause issues like this during the more typical races. It's primarily an issue when you combine an entire pack of cars in the rain with their headlights engaged. Still, despite these issues, as noted earlier, performance is generally very good here, so it's not something to be concerned with in most cases. But what about the replays? Well, when using ray tracing, the frame rate is capped at 30 frames per second, and this is maintained most of the time. Replays run very consistently and look great with RT reflections, but as you might guess, there is still a way to drop the performance. And it's just as we did before. Essentially, select a race at dusk or dawn with a full grid of cars in the rain, and watch as the frame rate dips below 30 frames per second. It's just a little too much for the poor PS5 to handle at native 4K resolution. But honestly, doing ray traced reflections of this quality, even at 30 FPS while targeting native 4K, that's a huge ask of the hardware. Thankfully though, even rain isn't a problem when the cars spread out like this. It's specifically the combination of a full pack with the rain and lighting that stresses the system. Now with ray tracing disabled, replays actually jump up to 60 frames per second, which is a great feature here, and it looks pretty good. This one though is a little more sensitive. As long as the pack is reasonably spread out like this, performance is stable and it looks fantastic. But once you start ramping up the number of cars in a scene and add in the rain, well, it plummets. So that's basically the situation with the performance, and yeah, the news is mostly good. However, I still maintain that a performance RT mode could have proven interesting for gameplay. I'd love to see it implemented, but at the same time, it's also possible that updating the BVH structure might prove too expensive to pull off during actual gameplay. So I don't want to get my hopes up. Either way, GT7 looks and runs great, but there is one other issue I want to discuss. That is the online nature of the game. Essentially, GT7 requires an internet connection, and I'm not really okay with this as it's effectively DRM, at least unless the game is patched. So years later, if you wanted to play GT7 and the servers were offline, well, you'd be stuck. But I wanted to test it for myself, what actually happens if you play it without an internet connection. Well, when you fire up the game without a connection, you're met with this message. You can button through it if you like, though it'll fight you every step of the way, and eventually you'll make it to the title screen. Here you'll note that the game is running in offline mode. Try to jump into the GT mode, however, and you're met with this. You can only access a single icon, and within there, you can only access custom races, and that's it. After completing the race then, this message popped up. Not great. But hey, at least you can enjoy the music rally with the soothing sounds of Hooked on Classics, Richard's favorite. But seriously, due to the way this is set up, GT7 is strictly an online game. It's certainly not an issue for the time being, of course, but it absolutely could become one down the line, which is precisely why it concerns me. It's basically a single black mark on an otherwise fantastic game. But if you can stomach the fact that it's an online-only game, it really is a fantastic return to form for the GT series. It might actually be the best Gran Turismo game to date. The new GT mode, for instance, is just a joy to explore. The whole cafe system now gives you goals to work towards that pushes you to explore all aspects of the game while getting to know the various cars. Weirdly enough, you'll also meet lots of characters throughout that sort of speak to you through these little portraits. It almost feels like a visual novel at times, which is kinda awesome. There's different types of events as well, and many different areas to explore on the map, as well as things like scapes, which places your car within photographs basically. This kind of demonstrates what a new game with pre-rendered backgrounds and 3D models might look like today, which yeah, it's pretty neat. So that's Gran Turismo 7, and also the end of this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this tour of the game, and keep an eye out because we'll have PS4 versus PS5 coverage coming soon. In the meantime though, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give us a like, check out the Digital Foundry supporter program, and of course come find us over on Twitter. We'll see you next time.